I haven't posted a video in some time. This has been due to my poor and declining health, a fact which is related to the subject of this video. This morning, I got a message from a former TWIM student who sent me a link to a new interview that Delson has done with Steve James of the Guru Viking Podcast. It was on the Guru Viking Podcast that myself and the world first heard Delson's claims to arahantship several years ago. Those claims made deep impacts on the lives of many people, profoundly negative impacts, unfortunately. The title of this interview is quite intriguing. It states that Delson has renounced his claims to attainment. Of course, we knew that Delson Armstrong was not truly what he claimed to be long before he himself became aware of this fact. We tried to reach him with reason with regard to this. We tried to seek some explanation for his conduct from him and those around him. But Delson surrounded himself with an impenetrable barrier of handlers, lieutenants, and rules of etiquette. He certainly could have saved himself a lot of struggle by simply being open to speaking with someone who had his long-term well-being in mind. I haven't seen this interview yet, and we'll be going through it together for the first time, me offering my reactions and commentary where appropriate. Let's take a look.
In this episode, I am once again joined by Delson Armstrong. In this interview, Delson renounces all of his previous claims to spiritual attainment. Delson details recent changes in his inner experience that saw him question the nature of his awakening, including the arising of emotions and desires that he thought had long been expunged. Delson critiques the consequences of the Buddhist doctrine of the 10 fetters, reveals his redefinition of awakening, and the stages of the four-path model from stream enterer to arhat, and challenges cultural ideas about enlightenment. Delson offers his current thoughts on the role of emotions on the spiritual path, emphasizes the importance of facing one's trauma, and discusses his plans to broaden his own teaching to include traditions such as Kriya Yoga. Delson also reveals the pressures exerted on him by others' agendas, and shares his observations about the danger of student devotion, the hypocrisy of spiritual leaders, and his own mixed feelings about the monastic sangha. So without further ado, Delson Armstrong.
Delson. So I can comment on the intro already. This isn't surprising, of course, because I was already well aware that Delson's claims to attainment were mistaken. And it's also not surprising the method of coping that he's used here from the summary that Steve James gives, which is very similar to Daniel Ingram's approach, which is to say that when he looks inside himself and he sees that he doesn't have the characteristics of an arahant, when he sees that he has greed, hatred, and delusion in his heart, rather than viewing that as him having failed to attain this state, he seeks to redefine what the state is. So, create a version of an arahant that can still have greed, hatred, and delusion. And hearing that Delson is disillusioned about student-teacher devotion and the dangers of spiritual teachers and gurus, it's quite rich coming from Delson, because he, to the extent that Delson is a victim here, he is certainly not the only one, and he has made victims of many others. So we'll see as this video continues what level of self-awareness Delson has about his role in this. I should point out that Delson has made no attempt to contact me since having this revelation. And as far as I'm aware, he hasn't made any attempt to contact the other people who have been harmed by his influence.
Armstrong, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, I'm so pleased to see you again. It's been a little while, too long, I think, since we last spoke, and I'm delighted to chat with you again.
Yes.
And the impetus for this recording, you've made a declaration, a written declaration, and you've recorded it on your new Delson Armstrong YouTube channel. And this is quite an interesting...
I haven't read this written declaration or seen Delson's video on his channel. This is news to me. I'll certainly investigate those later.
Interesting declaration indeed. And so you suggested we have an interview about it, and I agreed. I think it's remarkable what you've written here, and I'm looking forward to exploring it with you. Now, we were saying before that perhaps the thing to do would be to put up your declaration as it appears on your YouTube channel now, to insert it now, and then we'll comment on that.
Yeah.
So perhaps that's how we ought to start. Is there anything you want to say to introduce it before we go over to your pre-recorded declaration?
I think we should just go ahead and play it, and then we can discuss the context and the contents after that.
Okay. All right, so here it comes. Delson Armstrong's declaration from his YouTube channel, coming now.
To my students, friends, and well-wishers, first, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this. I welcome all comments and responses to my statements below. For those who would like to clarify any questions or concerns relating to them, please email me directly at dhammanomad9@gmail.com. This letter and this video reflects my current understanding and supersedes any statements, interviews, comments, podcasts, or other communications that have preceded it or are not released and endorsed by me. Let me be very clear about this. I have been interviewed in a way that has made me feel pressured and pigeonholed by the agendas of others. I would like to take this opportunity to reclaim my own narrative and speak to you directly from my own heart, using my own platform and my own words. Due to my series of interviews on many podcasts, including Guru Viking, there has been a growth in my popularity as a teacher. I did these interviews and taught in the way I did, targeted specifically to the TWIM community, because it reflected my understanding of the time, based on the system in which my experiences arose and the strong feedback of my teachers and mentors working from that model of evaluation. I suspect many of you may have come to me with the hopes of meeting with an arahant. I have never directly made this claim in public, and now
This is weasel words. He hasn't made the claim directly in terms of saying, I am an arahant, but he has strongly implied it, said that he had the attainment of the fourth path in fruition, which is what an arahant would have done. So Delson is using this as an out, but the extent to which he's misled people, it's not excused by just saying, oh, well, I didn't say outright I was an arahant. He's clearly wanted people to believe that he was an arahant. And I think this is a sign here that there hasn't been an appropriate level of growth as a result of the realization that his attainment was false. In the future.
I want to set the record straight. Owing to significant friction from people who are peripheral to my life and my professional activities, I have come to believe that the entire concept of attainments and gurus is causing more suffering than good at this point in time. For this reason, I renounce any claim to specific attainments in any spiritual system, whose parameters my teaching going forward may not be limited to. I am not any guru of any lineage. One of my intentions is to end the infantilization of both students and teachers, and to help people come out of this tired old model of guru worship and student disempowerment. I have spoken.
As far as it goes, this is a good thought. This guru-disciple relationship, which is something that Delson has been exposed to for quite some time as a result of his yoga practices and his interaction with Greg Halpern, who claims to be an expert hypnotist and certainly exerted some kind of dominating influence over Delson in the 6 years that they lived together in the same home.
Of many uncanny and strange experiences in my life and in the lives of others like Bhante Vimalaramsi. These experiences, however interesting, are not central to what I consider the spiritual path, and can often be nothing more than a distraction. For that reason, going forward, I wish to focus on what is
I think Delson is here referring to the powers or the iddhis, which again his mentor Greg Halpern claimed to possess, and Bhante Vimalaramsi as well implied that he possessed several powers. And this, again, as far as it goes, this is a good thought because the powers are not essential. There's only one power that is essential to the attainment of arhatship, and that power is the knowledge of the destruction of the corruptions. And this is not something that is part of the traditional list of psychic powers. Rather, this is something that the Blessed One added as the ultimate expression of psychic power. All of these other things are not necessary. It's not necessary to recall past lives. It's not necessary to experience the mind-made body and these other powers. In fact, those can be quite distracting and confusing for people. So in Delson's case, I guess the implication here is that he found these things to be confusing to him personally.
Essential to awakening, and leave these colorful anecdotes for sharing in a different context. I don't think it's possible for anyone, including myself, to awaken another person. I truly believe everyone has the capacity to awaken through their own efforts. I see myself as a consultant, a guide on the path. I do not consider myself to be an exclusively TWIM teacher. I question some of its tenets and its interpretations of the teachings of the Buddha. But this message is not meant to be a condemnation or endorsement of this practice or any other practice. In fact, I would like to say that I subscribe to all practices that allow for the release of suffering. I do not believe TWIM or any other tradition has a monopoly on that. I am wary of anyone who claims such things, and I urge.
So this is something that's half accurate. Certainly there are many practices that can, in some way, reduce stress. There are things that aren't even in the scope of meditation, such as going on a holiday can reduce someone's stress. But those things don't get at the core of the issue. They don't address the underlying cause of stress. And it is the case that there is only one teaching, namely the teaching of the Blessed One, that leads to the total end of stress. So these other paths, while they can be pursued to varying degrees of relief of stress, they never lead to the total cessation of stress. There's only one path that leads to that goal. But of course, for someone who hasn't reached the end of that path, it's impossible to be sure of that. And that's the situation that Delson is in. So he's found a dead end on one of these paths, and now he's retreating back to a point where he's open to the possibility that there is another path that leads to that result. But he's broadened his net too much in this instance. That's something that's necessary for him at this time. But in terms of what's actually true, there is one path that leads to the total cessation of stress. Delson has just not tried that one out yet.
You to apply the same level of healthy skepticism toward me as a teacher. I take full responsibility for all my words and actions, which have, to the best of my ability, always reflected my understanding at the time. If anyone feels hurt or misled by my expressions of my evolving journey or my ongoing attempts to apply those to helping others achieve greater freedom of mind, I apologize for that.
This is a classic non-apology. Notice he said, if anyone feels hurt. And he says he's taking responsibility, but in what way is he taking responsibility? For example, if a person had stolen something, taking responsibility in any form that doesn't involve returning the thing that they stole or compensating the person they stole it from for it, it's not really taking responsibility. And furthermore, you would expect them to turn themselves in to the police or the authorities or something for the appropriate process to ensue. That would be taking responsibility. Just saying you're taking responsibility, that's not it. There aren't just people who feel hurt by Delson's words and actions. There are people who have seriously been harmed. They've lost large sums of money. They've lost their livelihoods. They've lost their health. This is not a matter of people feeling that they were hurt. People were really harmed. And these kinds of non-apologies where people say, I'm sorry if you feel that way, that's an illustration of them not taking responsibility. So this is not a true apology from Delson. And if I were interviewing him instead of Guru Viking, I would press him on this point.
What I teach is what I've experienced myself. Experience is by definition subjective and not easy to verify empirically. So I offer you this caveat. If you feel inspired to, then come to me as a person seeking guidance from another person. I am imperfect, a human who has their own challenges, flaws, and concerns. What I choose to teach is what I directly know. I may, from time to time, use the past traditions and their ideas as references for what I teach, but not as verifiable truth. I wish everyone who listens to this or reads this does so in good health. I wish everyone happiness and awakening, whatever that means for you.
Wow, that's quite a
Now I can tell that Delson has strong feelings in this message, but I can also tell that he's not truly understanding his place in the world and how he's affected others. And wishing everyone awakening in terms of whatever it means for them, that is something that he's saying to be agreeable to people, to not offend people. But it's not something that's truly in their best interest. There is only one way of awakening that is going to be truly beneficial for people. Anything else is going to be a kind of a false awakening, which is a delusionary state like Delson was under for the past several years.
declaration indeed. Is there anything you'd like to say immediately? Any comment you'd like to make before we get into a back and forth discussion?
Well, maybe I'll just provide a little bit of context behind why I did the declaration. I've had time to kind of reflect on the last 3 years of teaching, specifically within, let's say, the TWIM methodology. And this last year, 2024, I actually took some time off. I tried to spend the entire year on sabbatical as much as I could, traveling and doing a little bit of writing. And I got in touch with some students, and they discussed, let's say, their challenges with TWIM, but more than that, discussing the aspects of like the community and, what is it exactly that I'm teaching and what is it that I really want to teach moving forward. And that was the impetus of my reflections. And I realized that, when I first came on to your podcast, which was, I guess, 2021, so it's been about now 3 years, it was a different context. It was a different time. And I was experiencing the things that I was experiencing at that time. But like anything with life, things evolve, situations change, and you start to grow, and I believe that stagnating as a teacher is not good for anybody, especially the teacher himself, but also the students. So my intention with this has been to be, upfront about this whole process. And so that's what kind of brought up this declaration.
Yes, I admire your courage, actually, in being upfront about this and thinking this through in such a public way. I admire that a great deal. Perhaps we can, one follow-up question from what you've just said is you had, and maybe this ties in with one of the sentences in your declaration, that you'd encountered some students who had some challenges with TWIM. And you also said here, to quote you, "I have been interviewed in a way that's made me feel pressured and pigeonholed by the agendas of others." Now, you emailed me actually after this declaration came out, and you said to me, "You didn't mean me," which is great relief. But so who are these others? And what is this agenda? And what do you mean by this pressure? And does that link in to these conversations you were having that led up to the declaration in the first place?
In part, and I don't want to necessarily go too much into detail about this particular person because they might probably want to remain anonymous. But I will just say, it was a time when I was up in the mountains and I invited various students to come spend some time with me in meditation and reflection. And one of them wanted me to actually create a series of videos with them and talk about, my experiences with TWIM. But as we started discussing, they realized that a lot of my thoughts about TWIM, a lot of my thoughts about the four awakening states, 10-footer model, all of these things had changed. And so in their mind, they felt betrayed because they were so inspired by the very first video where I had talked about my experiences and the way I see life at that point in time and so on. And so the video was done in such a way that I felt very uncomfortable with it because it made me, it felt like they were psychoanalyzing me. It felt like they had an agenda to basically, in some sense, destroy TWIM. And I that's why in my declaration, I also said, I don't have a condemnation of.
I don't know who these people were that were interviewing Delson, but I would say that it's not that people have an agenda to destroy TWIM. It's that there are these glaring problems, these glaring inconsistencies that are never addressed by the people involved, never addressed by Delson, never addressed by David Johnson. And anyone who can read the suttas can see this quite plainly, that they're misrepresenting the teaching. And there should be some explanation for that. When I was speaking to David and these people in my interactions, I was seeking an explanation. I thought surely they would have some reason. Even if it was just that devas came to Bhante Vimalaramsi in the night and told him something. But they wouldn't give an explanation. It was just deception after deception. And people pick up on this kind of thing. People, after a while, people realize that they're being lied to and manipulated, and they have questions. So it's not an agenda to destroy TWIM. It's just truth-seeking. That's all it is. And perhaps people take this kind of activity too far. There were many people who came to the Buddha and posed him these kind of gotcha questions that were just showing that they weren't interested in learning anything. They just wanted to find faults. And that's one thing, but there are so many blatant problems with TWIM, blatant inconsistencies that just haven't been addressed. There's no explanation for how did you fuse these two practices into one, and where did you come up with all this stuff? And so I'm not surprised that other people have questions about this. I had many questions, and I know that other students of TWIM that I've interacted with, they had many questions. Obviously, Oleg and Pavel from the document on Sutta, they had many questions, and these were never answered. So it seems like Delson was feeling a little bit cornered with that, having to justify things that maybe he himself wasn't informed about what the supposed justification for these beliefs was.
TWIM. I don't have an endorsement of TWIM either. I'm just teaching what I know works for me. And if, for whatever reason, because of my experience at that time, I might have misled people into TWIM because of that reason, I take full accountability for that. And, I would apologize if they felt that way. So the whole video felt like they were trying to bring up a certain tradition or a certain kind of way of looking at things. And I wanted to address that on this podcast, which is like, there is, I think, in different communities, this idea of like, we are right and we are the ones, we have the magic formula and the secret fairy dust to awakening or enlightenment or whatever. And because of my travels, because of my actual process of teaching in the last 4 years, it's really shown me a different side of things. So that whole thing about, being pressured and pigeonholed is because I realized that that video or any other kind of interview where they're looking for me to, in some sense, validate their own viewpoints, or in other ways to denounce another tradition, that's not me, and I wouldn't want to do that.
That's fine for it not to be Delson. Delson doesn't have to teach. He doesn't have to present himself as a spiritual leader, as a guru. If he doesn't know what he's talking about, he doesn't have to try to teach it. That doesn't mean that people who do know what they're talking about shouldn't denounce things that they know to be misleading or harmful, etc. And of course, he's not wrong when he says that every school of practice out there thinks that they have the secret. This is just the way it is. This is the way it has always been. But that doesn't mean there isn't one path that leads to the actual goal. And also, people differ in their goals. So I've mentioned this in past videos. None of the people today claiming enlightenment or seeking it at a high level actually even know what was being referred to. They're very much off the mark in terms of what the actual goal is that the Blessed One was pursuing and reached. So there's a huge amount of confusion there. The solution, though, isn't to say that all of these things are right in their own ways and everyone gets to have their own personal truth, because that while that pleases people and that maybe avoids confrontation, it doesn't help people. It does a disservice to people who may have been in a place and with the appropriate conditions to actually attain what can be attained.
See, so when you write here, you've been interviewed in a way that's made you feel pressured and pigeonholed. You're talking about a specific interview that's happened.
That has happened, and I don't think it's released yet. And I had requested them not to because it just didn't come off the way I would have wanted to, because it made me seem like, I was the sort of like manipulator or villain, and I felt manipulated in the video itself because of the way it was done. I mean, it was very, very slimy, really. It felt very slimy.
Here I sense some projection on Delson's part. There are many people who would perceive the way Delson has conducted himself in the past several years as being quite, truly slimy.
In our previous interviews that have been published on the channel, you have talked about your experiences in various traditions and what you've gained from them and so on. And at the time we talked, you'd had profound benefit from all of the traditions you listed, in fact, including TWIM, actually. But there wasn't necessarily a sense of exceptionalism that you were towards TWIM or any other system, or indeed denigration of any other system. I don't think in our conversations you've ever betrayed a hint of that, actually.
Nor was that my intention. Definitely not.
So you've been teaching now for 3 years, right? Or you had a 3-year span, anyway, of teaching. I wonder if you might talk a bit about that span, about how it began, about the sorts of activities you were engaged in during that period, what you learned and what you encountered. You've written here that you've traveled all around the world and you've noticed things and you've been exposed to different things and you've made some observations that are informed a sort of change in the way you think and present. So I wonder if you might tell a bit the story of this teaching period, the arc you went through, and some of the things you learned along the way.
Yeah, definitely. So, since our very first interview back in 2021, I was not teaching proper. I mean, before then, I was kind of doing some online retreats using the TWIM methodology while I was in Cambodia. And then I was invited to visit Sukha by Bhante Vimalaramsi, who's now passed on. But it was to meet with him and kind of get a sense of where I was with the practice and get a sense of whether I wanted to teach or not. And continue teaching or not. And actually, my very first talk at Sukha was upon his invitation. He actually asked me to do a talk on dependent origination. And it was a very, very surreal experience for me because I didn't realize that when he said to talk about it, that I thought we would be teaching together in the sense of we would be sitting together. But in the Dhamma hall that we were at, he actually sat with the rest of the audience. And so it felt really interesting. And I think it was a perception shift for a lot of the members of the community at the time, that here Bhante is basically saying that, hey, listen to this guy. And so that was really my first forte into teaching TWIM at Sukha. And then after that, I started teaching in Europe. I went to the Netherlands, went to the UK, and so on. And while I was teaching at Sukha, what I noticed was there's definitely an emphasis on the benefits of TWIM, because they're obviously espousing that. But I also was not comfortable with necessarily, like, I wouldn't say denigrating, but just putting aside other practices. And I noticed, if I talked about other practices or somebody else mentioned in the audience about other practices, there would be a sort of like tension there, a little psychic tension about that, which I, for myself, was like, okay, I mean, if a person wants to talk about that practice, that's fine. But It's just dependent upon how they want to spend their time on retreat. So that was in Dhammasukha. And I will just say my time at Dhammasukha has always been like a lot of fun. The staff over there are very, very, very supportive of me. You know, David, who I think you've interviewed a couple of times, David Johnson, you know, he's become a very good friend of mine, and he remains a very good friend of mine and a very good supporter of mine as well. And, you know, with the rest of the staff. And so he and I have a very personal relationship. He helps me with a lot of my planning and scheduling of retreats, but that's on the professional side of things. But on a personal level, we're really great friends, and I have great respect for him. And he's somebody who's seen it all, you know, at some level with regards to Buddhism, at least. And you know, he and I traveled through India, and he got to see another side of India when he went to Rishikesh, Varanasi. And he came actually to my mother's place, had lunch with us, and so on. So I've had great connections in the TWIM community. I've had some wonderful people who have had their own ideas of what TWIM is and how a teacher should be. So I did see that part where there was sort of a distinction between who the student is and who the teacher is. And you know, people wanted to really be definitive on that distinction. I didn't think much of it because I was just going with the flow and just to see how this whole process is. And that's why I call it an experiment. I mean, if I look at it in hindsight, that whole process of teaching was sort of an experiment to see how it goes, because I had no intention of like this being my career, let's say. Then I went to India, and in India, it was very interesting. I was not really fully welcomed by, let's say, the TWIM community, or at least the elders of the TWIM community in India. There was a bit of a hesitation. There was enthusiasm within the board, but one particular person was kind of like suspicious or doubtful of what I could do. And at the time when I was teaching, that particular person was going to be teaching with me, but then they fell ill. So they basically had to opt out from co-teaching with me. So there was another person who would have been teaching with me, and I suggested that they teach with me. And it seemed like it didn't go that well because there was already some tension there. And I could sense that, and I vouched for this person. And so they did co-teach with me at a couple of retreats while I was in India. The thing I noticed in India is this whole process of like real reverence for the teacher, real sort of almost deification of the teacher. And I admire their genuine and sincere reverence for this, but I also saw a danger in it. Not necessarily for myself, because I could see through the fact that these people were very, very humble, very respectful, and they truly, honestly wanted to learn. But I could see how their sincerity, almost innocence in the way that they were so giving of themselves to the teacher. I mean, they would, you know, bow down and touch your feet and all of these things, which you see in other traditions as well in India. And that's what I wanted to point out, you know, with my declaration and you know, upcoming article, is that this idea of guru worship can be to the detriment of the student. And I have.
Yes, it can. It certainly depends on the character of the person being worshipped in this sense, more than anything. In India in particular, it's a huge problem with gurus taking advantage of this kind of devotion and exploiting their followers. Now, it seems like Delson doesn't believe that he's guilty of this, but the fact is he has been doing that. He's been selling people a false bill of goods, and he's been teaching people, teaching retreats, teaching classes about something he doesn't understand. And although that may not seem as severe as these gurus who are sexually exploiting their followers, bear in mind that we're talking about people's long-term well-being, the chance of them reaching the total end of suffering or continuing to suffer over and over and over again. So it's not a trivial thing.
I've seen for myself how people who are other teachers take advantage of that. They ask for different kinds of favors, and they ask for different kinds of, for money or resources or whatever it is. And, my experience with the monastic community has been so-so. I don't have anything against the monastic community, but what I have seen is that there is no real difference between the monks and the lay people in terms of their imperfections. There's a tendency for the mind when it starts off to see monks as somehow they have something that we don't, and they are maybe, more evolved than us in some way because maybe they have had time for practice and all of that. And so my experience with them has helped me to see them without those rose-tinted glasses. I mean, I've seen a few situations where, they talk about the fact that, they walk barefoot and, they won't touch money, and they're not about becoming like a big leader in the community and all that. And then push comes to shove, I see them getting upset when money is not given to them, and them creating this community around them where they become sort of a cult leader. And I've seen this more than once. I've heard of situations where monastics are fighting amongst each other on principles of the Dharma, on principles of what the Buddha said or what he didn't say, or just criticizing each other, or getting into even fist fights. So that has left me kind of disillusioned.
So regarding this, I don't think Delson has read the suttas, because this kind of thing was happening quite a lot in the time of the Buddha as well. Not all monks were stream enters even. In fact, this is unavoidable, because at the time a person ordains, they're putting on the robes before they've learned anything about how to actually attain stream entry. Typically, there were a few instances where people attained stream entry prior to ordaining. But for the most part, your typical monk is joining with the hopes of learning how to attain stream entry. So it's not surprising, since they're not noble persons, that they're not finding it easy to even behave like noble persons would behave. But we can forgive Delson in this instance, because when he came into TWIM, Bhante, Vimalaramsi, and David Johnson were presenting all of these other people, including the monastics in the TWIM community, as having some degree of awakening, when in fact they do not.
With the spiritual community. So I was, let's say, wet behind the ears when I first did the interview with you. Didn't realize that this could all happen. But then also being exposed to the doubts and the questions of students themselves. And this is what I mean when I say that, like teachers should never stop learning. Like an ideal teacher should continue to learn from their students. And a student never stops teaching, because a student should hold teachers accountable. And what I'm talking about in terms of doubts of students is that, within the TWIM community, we have, for example, there's a subscription to the 10 fetter model, which I question, and we can get into that. But the reason I question it is because it creates so much psychic tension for the student, where they feel like there's this narrative of success that they need to get into when they're doing the practice. And at that point, the idea is, if you're an anagami or an arahat, that means you no longer experience sexual feelings, or you no longer experience desire for sense pleasures. And a lot of our students, my students especially, 99% of them are in the lay life. They're non-monastics. And I realized that for them, it's actually a source of pain and suffering rather than a source of like liberation, because they have families to take care of. They have relationships that they want to evolve into marriages. They want to build a family, and if it means that if I want to build a family, it gets in the way of my ability to have awakening, there's a disconnect there. So that's made me question that whole process in how to teach and what those models actually do for a person.
Of course, there were many lay followers of the Blessed One at the time. And these people had families and relationships, loved ones, in many cases. Here, Delson seems to want to accommodate people in order to please them, in order to have followers that will give him resources. Pleasing people is not the same thing as helping them. It is simply the truth, simply a fact that some things are incompatible with full awakening. And sensual desire is one of these things. It isn't necessary for everyone to seek full awakening. There were many people at the time of the Buddha who only sought a favorable rebirth. And that's fine if that's what you want. If somebody wants to suffer, even if suppose somebody wanted to be reborn in hell, they didn't even want a favorable rebirth. They just wanted to suffer for an eon. Like some people I've interacted with recently act as if is the case. That's their choice. If they want to suffer, that's their choice. The unfortunate thing is that in order to achieve that, they have to hurt other people. And that's not okay. That's not fine. But for the few who are seeking the anagami fruition and beyond, who are interested in that, which again, bear in mind that none of these people that Delson was interacting with were in risk of that. The best case is that they were pretending to have the characteristics of someone with that level of attainment. But the true goal of the holy life, there's no contest between that and anything else. The idea that you would trade sensual pleasures or worldly success for that, to someone who understands, it doesn't compute. So the people who are conflicted about that, they're not at risk of attaining the anagami path in any case. You see, the two things are incompatible. So as to the extent that they're at a point where they're not willing to give up these worldly concerns, they won't be able to attain the goal anyway. So they're just frustrating themselves in some way. And that's not something that a noble person who is trying to teach the true Dhamma would be concerned with accommodating. If they want to seek a favorable rebirth instead of the deathless, then they're free to do that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't teach the path to the deathless just to accommodate people's desires.
And the other thing that I would say in terms of my experience has been, there are some universalities that I've seen amongst the students that I've helped and the participants of my retreats, which is not only this particular thing about, becoming an anagami or an arahat or whatever, but also that ultimately there's this level of like how should I put it? There's this level of like sincerity in the way they come to the teacher. And there's a level of like total open-mindedness in terms of what this practice is. And I find that very beautiful because they're so humble in their approach. But I also question the actions that are taken by some teachers. Not that I'm saying that any teacher within the community is like that, where they might take advantage of the student, but that there's a potential for that possibility to happen. And so I want to even bring that forward out into the conscious, so that people are aware of this, and they can be wary of it if something like that does happen.
That's very interesting indeed. I wonder if we might talk a bit more then about this 10-fetter model and your reflections on this prompted by these discussions with students you've had. Would you be able to explain briefly what the 10-fetter model is and then what your reflections are about it? Yeah,
so I mean, I would say, let's say the traditional understanding, or generally the traditional understanding of the 10-fetter model, is that it's linked to the stages of awakening within at least Theravada Buddhism. And you have the first 3 fetters, which are dropped when you stream enter, which is, the first fetter is the doubt in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. The second fetter is, attachment to rites and rituals. And the third fetter is, a self-view, intellectual belief in a personal self. The fourth and fifth are related to sensual pleasure. I mean, I'm saying traditionally they talk about like there's sensual desire that's gone away, and there's aversion that's gone away when somebody becomes an anagami. And then the last 5 are gone completely when you become an arhat, which is conceit, restlessness, and remorse, craving for jhanas, craving for formless jhanas, and ignorance. But I think it's more helpful for people to kind of understand that these are all models and these are all structures that might help for specific cultural projections. So what I mean by that is every tradition has a certain level of idealization of what it means to be awakened. In the Theravadan perspective, it's the Arhat. The Arhat is the foremost in terms of the practitioners. He or she has perfected the practice. In Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, it's Jivan Mukta, somebody who's liberated while living. And there's all kinds of ideas about what that means. There's in the Bhagavad Gita, the Sthita Pragya, who is one established in wisdom and what that means, or the Gunatita. I mean, there's different names for these things or these ideas. And so what I want to shed light on is actually, why do we have these structures in the first place? I believe that these are all the cultural projections of the time for what their idea of a perfect person was, or their idea of what it meant to be fully awakened. But what I've noticed now is those very same structures create an imprisonment, or create this sort of, pigeonholing of like, this is the only way that it's possible. I truly believe that if somebody is fully awakened, they transcend all models and systems. They might traverse through them and they might use them if it makes sense and as it would seem appropriate for situations. But if it is used in a way of like a goal-oriented process, which is what I've seen in a lot of retreats, not just mine or TWIM retreats, but in any retreat where people have a certain orientation towards achieving something. And that orientation then turns into obsession. And that obsession then turns into like questioning one's own self worth, questioning whether one can even actually do this or not. So I think redefining and recontextualizing the 10 fetters might be one way of going about this, but that's just one step. Ultimately, understanding some very basic principles, in my view, which is that if you have genuine connection with people, if you have the ability to be an ethical person, because I still stand by that we need ethics, we need morals in order to do this practice or any other spiritual practice. And there might be a level of, I wouldn't say perfection in ethics, but a level of like standardization of ethics, which is that, do no harm. Don't harm yourself and don't harm others. If you can do just that, I think that being the first step and that being enough to get to the next step, which is having a collected mind. And then from there, having the wisdom and understanding of what that means, what is your place in the world, who you are in the world, and what existence is. And that can mean many different things depending upon the tradition and the culture. So ultimately what I'm saying is the 10 fetter model is something I think we should look into as redefining, if that would help, or at least stop obsessing over to the point where we're looking for perfection. Because
perfection is the goal. So this is just Delson rationalizing his failure to attain this degree of perfection, saying that we should throw out the whole system, throw out the idea that it's even possible. Again, that might seem to help Delson cope with his life in the short term. But the impact on others is that it's denying people who were capable of attaining that degree of perfection the opportunity. And this has been Delson's role in the world. His place in the world has been as a trap for true seekers of knowledge and wisdom. He has been an agent of Mara, an agent of destruction of what is good in the world. He's been an obstruction to those who might have found refuge in the deathless, who might have been extremely content with being in a state of perfection and not found that these temptations Delson is referring to were a total insurmountable obstacle to that attainment.
In the pursuit of that perfection, it creates all kinds of conflict in the mind, all kinds of conflict within the community as well.
This brings to mind something you wrote in your declaration, in which we heard earlier. You say, owing to significant friction from people who are peripheral to my life and my professional activities, I've come to believe that the entire concept of attainments and gurus is causing more suffering than good at this point in time. For this reason, I renounce any claim to specific attainments in any spiritual system, whose parameters my teaching going forward may not be limited to. So I have a couple of questions about this. You're talking about the 10 fetters here, and the traditional view, or a traditional view, that they're tied to these 4 stages of awakening on the way from Stream Enterer to Arhat. You've recounted your own experience of those fetters being dropped in that traditional way. And here you're renouncing any claim to specific attainments. So I wonder if I might clarify with you, are you renouncing those attainments because you think it's unhelpful to declare them and that they're causing problems for others? Or are you renouncing it because you no longer believe in those structures or believe in those attainments in the way that you previously described them? Or both?
In this case, it's both. So let me explain what I mean by that. In the first instance, I have found them unhelpful because of the fact that they become sources of obsession for students. Now, yes, you did mention, I think in our first interview, I did talk about this, and in my experience, how I felt, even related to the sexual experience. And at that point, if I remember correctly, you did ask me, like, do you still have like the sexual impulse? And at the time, I would have said no. And it would have been the truth because of the fact that in that moment, or not even in that moment, in those months, in those weeks, in those whatever time that I was doing this process, I didn't feel it. And I didn't have any urges. And I didn't have any experience of wanting a relationship or, connecting with someone on a romantic level or whatever it was. But things have changed. And that has changed for me. Not only with that, but everything else. And I'll get into that. But yeah, in terms of what I said with regards to both, one is I don't see it as being helpful, and that's why I'm renouncing it. And second, I don't believe in it because of my own experience with it and the experience of others as well.
This is the experience of others in the TWIM teaching. As I've mentioned many times before, there are no stream enters, no Sakadagamis, no Anagamis, and no Arahants among the Sutawedans. There's not one of them. So it's not surprising that their experience doesn't align with the dropping of the fetters.
I think to try to believe in something is helpful only insofar as that being training wheels. But at the end of the day, you have to be available to your own experience, which could be good, bad, or indifferent, which could be enlightening, which could be your shadow self, which could be all of these aspects. And that's why I believe
shadow self is a psychological concept that does not appear in the Dhamma.
That the journey to awakening is a very personal one. And the models that we use, whether it's Jungian archetypes, whether it's Joseph Campbell's monomyth, whether it's the Vedantic tradition, whether it's the Theravada tradition, whether it's deity worship in Tibetan Buddhism, in Vajrayana, whether it's Tantra, all of these things are, I would say, equally valid insofar as if the intention is the alleviation of suffering, because that is ultimately what I do believe in, is, teaching as the Buddha would teach according to the suttas, suffering and the end of suffering. And there has been a tendency to go towards the end of suffering, which is great. But what about the suffering part? I've noticed that there's a kind of glossing over of that. And I believe that that journey to understand what that suffering means to you or to me or to anyone is limited to that particular individual. And so one's enlightenment, one's awakening is very personal. And the outside world is the outside world. It's the conditions that lead you to beginning the questioning process of, why am I suffering? How is this suffering arising? What do I do with this suffering? And so the Buddha will tell you, according to the Pali Canon, there's a way out of this suffering using the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths and so on and so forth. So these are all models, the 37 requisites of awakening. The Vedantin will tell you it's all about understanding your place, as, especially Advaita, it's all about understanding your place as being one with the existence, one with Brahman. Atman, I am Brahman, which means the Atman is Brahman. Tattvam asi, aham brahmasmi, right? I am the universal self. Or any other practice is ultimately for the alleviation of suffering. And I would say that if it is not leading to the alleviation of suffering, why are you doing it? I would ask that to a person. Why are you doing it? And I believe that is the motivation behind everybody's journey here. Or if not everybody, most people's. So,
yes, that's the problem. That Vedic view of attaining union with Brahma, it's not the end of suffering. So why are you doing it? That may be useful as an intermediate step. So this is one of the ways. the Buddha was very successful at converting Brahmins. Brahmanism was the dominant religious view of the time. And the Brahmins all wanted to attain this union with Brahma, but they didn't know how. The Buddha, in his teaching, he could explain to them how to attain union with Brahma, how to have that experience of being in the company of Brahma. And that was enticing for them. And so they would be converted. But through being exposed to the entire teaching, they would eventually learn that that was far short of the goal, that it was possible to attain the company of Brahma. But it was insufficient. It would not be as satisfying as they had anticipated. And there was more to do. And so it's that more to do, which is where that's what separates all of these other practices that could be reducing suffering in some way. And attaining the company of Brahma, it is a reduction in suffering in the short term, in a temporary sense. But to really finally reach the total end of suffering, you have to do more than that. You have to go far beyond that. And this is a place that Delson hasn't tread before. And no one that he's speaking to in these anecdotes has tread this ground before. In fact, it's Delson's delusion and his preconceptions about how all of this works that has prevented him from availing himself of the opportunity to speak to someone who actually has tread that ground before.
Just to simplify that answer, I'm saying both, right? I'm saying that it has helped maybe in the past, but I found it to be something that is limiting and is not in tune with how I'm experiencing things. And also, I don't believe it to be useful in the ultimate sense.
And you said that your own experience or changes in your own experience also challenged your previously held ideas about that system. And you'd said that you'd be willing to talk a bit about that. Could we discuss a bit of that? I must say, Delson, I do admire your, from the first interview, I've admired your frankness and openness about your experiences. I think it's a great, it's to your credit, actually. And you're displaying the same trait here, even though your experience has changed and some of your thinking has changed, even about your own experience. I admire that a great deal. I'll just say that for the record. But in any case, are you willing to talk a bit about these changes in your own experience and how that's caused you to reevaluate the model of attainment that you previously held?
Yeah, of course. I think it'll be really important for the viewers to kind of understand more about that and explore what those changes are. I mean, I can talk about like the fact that in my experience with regards to the faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, which is, the destruction of the first fetter. Yes, I realize that, but I also, might say that, well, whatever the Buddha has taught is whatever the Buddha has taught. But I've noticed that there is an almost like a Christianization of Buddhism. And what I mean by that is that the Christian ideal is, Jesus is your Lord and Savior, and therefore when you believe in him, you go to heaven. And I've seen that happening in some traditions of Buddhism, where if you believe in the Buddha, that's more than enough. If you give your devotion to the Buddha, if you have total unconquerable faith, unshakable faith in the person, and that's the way I'm looking at it, is people are mistaking this, and I'm going to point this out here, which is, I think in my opinion, they're mistaking what the Buddha represents, because there is the person that is Siddhartha Gautama, and there is the Buddha, which is the experience of awakening. And so there is a kind of a worship of the Buddha as the person. And I would even point out in the sutta, it talks about, one of the suttas, it talks about this in the Vakali Sutta, where, Vakali is this old guy who wants to see the Buddha before he dies. And in fact, actually, he wants to end his own life because he's maybe has a terminal illness or whatever it is. And he goes to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, "How are you feeling? I mean, are you feeling better?" He says, "No, I'm not feeling better." He says, "Do you have any regrets? Do you have any remorse over anything?" And he says, "I do." And so the Buddha says, "Well, is it regarding anything you did in relation to virtue and ethics?" He says, "No." And he says, "Then why do you have that restlessness and remorse?" He says, "Because I was not able to see you, and I wanted to see you." And the Buddha basically then just says, "Why are you taking this foul body to be the Buddha? One who sees the Buddha sees the Dhamma, and one who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha." So my perspective on what it means to have faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha has changed. I see it as the possibility of awakening, right? That there is a possibility of awakening. So I trust in that. The Dhamma as the set of teachings laid out from the Buddha and other practitioners, and the Sangha as your friends and fellow practitioners in the Dhamma, monastic or otherwise. That's what's made me see it in this way. Like I don't believe in creating some kind of devotion to the personhood of the Buddha. I think, first of all, that totally negates the idea of all is empty. Then that's like you're reifying the Buddha as a person. When it comes to, let's say, the latter fetters, like, for example, a sensual desire and aversion, which it's commonly referred to as or translated as, I think there's a different way of looking at it, which is, like, let's say I'm somebody, or there's somebody who loves pizza, and apparently they're an anagami. So does that mean that they no longer like pizza? Maybe they have a preference for pizza rather than Chinese food or whatever it is. So this idea of like no more craving for sensual pleasures, I think it means not being obsessed by sensual pleasures. And that's different from saying, hey, I enjoy a good piece of pizza once in a while, or I enjoy watching this movie, or I enjoy whatever it is. And I would even go as far to say that relates to even sex or having romantic partnerships, because it's a biological instinct. I don't think the end of craving is the destruction of basic biological and emotional instincts. If you get pissed off, if you're angry, fine. In that moment, you are angry. But what do you choose to do with it? The ruminating of it, the bashing of yourself for getting angry, or, getting angry and then exploding out and then doing all these things. Does that mean that you no longer, does that mean then you have aversion? I would say that when we talk about aversion, it doesn't mean the elimination of anger or frustration and so on and so forth. Rather, the way I look at it is the elimination of aversion is essentially that arises. Like, I see it as two sides of the coin. Like, you have sensual desire and you have aversion. Now I'm calling it the obsession around some kind of desire to possess something sensual, whether it's a relationship, whether it's money, whether it's food, whether it's a house, whether it's whatever it is. And when that is not met, the experience that one has is aversion. That's the way I see it. However, I'm not saying that somebody can completely eliminate anger either. I don't think that that's possible, because you need some of these so-called unwholesome emotions to sometimes protect yourself. And in that moment, when you're in a fight or flight situation, you can't just be like, I'll just let them walk over me. You can't do that. I mean, that's ineffective.
You can't do that, Delson. That doesn't mean it's not possible for somebody else to do that. And this is all covered very both explicitly and implicitly in the suttas. You can see how the Buddha and his Arhat disciples led by example in this. They did not only did they not act out of anger, but they didn't have anger arise in them. And that is possible, but it's not easy, right? It's not easy for someone who doesn't understand or doesn't practice properly to attain that. But it is possible to attain it. Delson's final point here is based in a view of self-preservation, which is something that the Arhat has, by definition, totally transcended interest in. This is what is meant by having a refuge. Say someone were to steal something from an Arhat or strike them. There's nothing left to take that they haven't already given up. So it doesn't sting them in the same way that it stings someone without that level of attainment. This is, again, very much like the position that Daniel Ingram arrived at, where he could look in his heart and see that he had greed, hatred, and delusion, and still call himself an Arhat. That isn't the way to do it. The Buddha told us this is possible. And it's true. It is possible. He wouldn't have said it if it wasn't possible. But again, it's certainly not easy, and everything in the world is set against it. It's including people like Delson Armstrong are set against permitting anyone to experience that and to maintain it.
There is the simile of the saw, which is, a very interesting sutta, which goes through this whole process of anger and so on. And the Buddha talks about how even if someone were to be chopping your limbs or sawing off your limbs cut by cut, you would still have loving kindness. I've read this a few times to different students, and you can see the looks on their faces is like, is he really expecting us to just let people walk all over us, let alone have somebody just, saw off our limbs and still be smiling and having loving kindness towards them? So that's what I question. I mean, I think there's a balance to be had about these things. Now, even the deeper fetters, the higher fetters of restlessness and conceit and these things, I've recontextualized them from my own experience, which is the way I see conceit is it's the mind that compares between what you have or what you think you are and the outside world. There's a certain separateness, and therefore things are either better than your situation, worse than your situation, or the same as your situation. But that's only surface level. The way I see conceit now is that it is essentially the mind that is seeking security in an otherwise unsecure and insecure existence. The moment that we come out in birth from the womb, we are thrust into this cold world, and we seek that same level of security. And that is the process of conceit. Ignorance I see as just a lack of mindfulness in every moment. Now, that's why I think this whole process is very fluid. And I think to say that awakening is something that's static and that only that it's achievement oriented is a reflection of the times of the Pali Canon, let's say, or whatever tradition is talking about these things. And I think over a period of time, that idealization has only become more and more dense, much heavier, much more ingrained. in spiritual communities. And it's almost like there's a desire to escape from the mundane and go into the super mundane without dealing with all of the shadow stuff that you have to deal with in order for you to actually fully integrate. So I would redefine awakening as a process of going through that journey, going through, the pain and the sorrow. Maybe you start off with that, going through the process of meditation, going through the process of insight and understanding. And then there comes a point where all of that becomes your reality, but then there's a call back to home where you still have to deal with all of the inner stuff that might still be there in the subconscious. I don't believe that awakening just totally erases the shadows of the unconscious, the traumas of the subconscious. I believe there's still work to be done there. And even if, let's say, in an ideal world, somebody was to do that, does that mean that they're awakened? No, that's not how I would define awakening. Because to define awakening as anything creates conflict in the mind, because now there's a goal to achieve. What I believe now is that liberation is possible in every moment, and that people are already liberated. Underneath all of that, the mind is already liberated.
Okay, this is hardly a novel idea by Delson here. This is a prominent idea in several schools of Buddhism, the idea that everyone is already enlightened, and their enlightenment is just covered up with some stuff, and you got to clear that stuff away and it'll be enlightenment underneath. This isn't the case.
Underneath all the subconscious trauma, underneath all the unconscious desires, underneath all the conscious beckoning and chasing around and looking and seeking, if the mind were just to remain still for a moment, all of that disappears. And in that moment, the mind is liberated. And I think then once that realization comes, the task at hand is to see that as much as one can see without ignoring or trying to gloss over the darker aspects of the mind.
That's very interesting indeed. I'm curious.
The Buddha didn't teach people to ignore or gloss over the darker aspects of the mind. He taught them to abandon those things, to eradicate them, to extirpate them, to pull them up by the root, to burn them down, to destroy them. That's what he taught. So again, Delson is rebelling against something he never understood in the first place.
Curious then about how, if you have thoughts as to how to work with that material, that shadow material, that subconscious trauma, etc. And I'm also curious to throw in another question, at the risk of asking two questions at the same time, which is this four-path model then of stream enterer, once returner, never returner, arhat. Have you thought again about those waypoints? They're sometimes presented as permanent watershed points. You've passed that, you're never going back, something fundamental's changed, you're a stream enterer. And now, of course, you move to the next one, etc. Going through the cycle of insight. Has your thought on that four-path model changed?
Actually, this is a good question, because it was a recent conversation I had with a couple of friends. Maybe a few weeks ago, we had gone up to Manali, and this whole conversation came up about like the four awakening stages model. And I said, maybe we can redefine it a certain way, a different way. Again, what I wanted to point out to them and to everybody else who's watching now is that, again, these are models. In other words, these are the rafts that help you to take you from one shore to the other shore, in some sense. But there's a tendency in the communities that I've seen, and I think general spirituality, to create rafts upon rafts upon rafts. So at a let's say a higher elevation point, we can say that these stages of awakening are ultimately nothing in in the absolute sense. Like, so I've even helped to redefine those models from my experience and my understanding. And I completely accept that this can be, wrong. This could be totally my delusions, completely fine. But the way I would redefine these levels of awakening is this. If you look at somebody who's stream enter, in my experience of observing people who claim stream entry from the community or who are claimed to be stream enters, or even Dhamma followers for that matter, they're very passionate about the Dhamma. They will try to get every book, every video, every Dharma talk, everything that they can get their hands on because they're so passionate about the Dhamma. Like they've sought something and now it feels to them that they have found something that really works. It clicks. Everything clicks in their mind. In my mind, the once returner is somebody who has to, let's say a stream enter has to keep coming back to the Dhamma until they have to return one more time. And then there's an establishing of the mind in being in the Dharma. Like they now know for a fact that this works. And not only that this works when they become a stream enter, but that it actually helps them relieve suffering whenever it arises in the mind. And they have some level of experience in the meditation practice, in the wisdom practices. A non-returner, in my mind, is someone who doesn't have to go elsewhere to seek refuge in the Dhamma. Like it's come to a point where their mind doesn't waver away from the Dhamma. They, in essence, see the Dharma in everything. So it's like the mind doesn't have to return back from that point or that point. It's always the Dharma. Everything is contextualized through the Dharma. And the way I see the Arahant is somebody who actually transcends all of that. And at the risk of sounding cryptic, the way I define someone who's an Arahant is someone who sees the non-Dharma in the Dharma and someone who sees the Dharma in the non-Dharma. So what that would mean to me, or how I would explain that, is the difference between somebody who's an Anagami and an Arahant is essentially a certain level of bias with regards to the Dharma. Like for an Anagami, they would see nothing but their bias of what they see as the truth. And everything else, outside of that is secondary to it. Whereas I think somebody who is an Arahant, they would be able to explore every facet of reality and still be able to come to the Dharma in some sense. And they don't have any qualms. They don't have any hesitation to explore things that are seen as outside the Dharma.
That's fascinating.
So again, Delson is doing here precisely what I pointed out earlier, where he's playing games with the language to reconceptualize the four types of noble persons as stages in his own development. So whatever happened to him, that has to be the new standard. It's exactly what Daniel Ingram has done. And it's a little bit shocking that having an example like Ingram and others isn't enough to trigger self-awareness in Delson, that he's doing that same thing. And of course, he's also eschewing the concept of rebirth in his description of the four types of noble persons. Whereas in the suttas, in the teaching of the Buddha, it's quite clear that this is related to the process of rebirth. And it's not this kind of vague conceptual thing that Delson's making it out to be. This is just Delson making an excuse for bringing in all these practices that he grew up with as being part of the path, which he's been doing all along, but in a masked manner. And now he's taking the mask off and saying, Well, what an arhat really is whatever I am.
Indeed. You know,
well, that was the second question. The first question was about the material. How would you deal with the subconscious traumatic material? So let me address that as well.
Okay.
I think the way to look at this is there are all kinds of modalities that can help with this process, and you just have to find what works for you. And so I can provide what works for me, and if it works for you, then you try it out and see for yourself. And in my view, in my experience, what has worked for me is essentially my journey, which has been personal to me. The yoga philosophy, the practices that I've done, Kriya Yoga, the TWIM practice, the Dzogchen, Mahamudra, all of these things have really helped to bring this out. But for some people, maybe it's therapy. For some people, maybe it's talk therapy. For some people, maybe it's ayahuasca. For some people, it's whatever it might be for you. And so what I would just say is when it comes to facing the shadow, one of the things that is very helpful is to lean into it. Whatever it is that you're afraid of, whatever it is that you're anxious about, whatever it is that you find anger towards, whatever you find resistance towards, the more you resist, the more the shadow grows. But the more you lean into it, the more it sheds light onto the shadow, and therefore it becomes more manageable and easier to navigate through.
Thank you very much. One of the shadows of spiritual attainment, I think classically, or ideas of spiritual attainment, is experiencing something that you thought you'd left behind a long time ago. And so therefore, sometimes somebody who considers themselves to be spiritually attained or occupies a social role of holiness, a cleric of some type, for example, has great difficulty seeing in themselves unholy things, for example, because it goes against their identity, it goes against who they must be, and that can come from, in a sense, it can come from a very good place, but it can fester. And it could become a blind spot. It's sort of the definition of a shadow in a sense, something about yourself that you can't see.
Yeah.
And so, in your case, on the one hand, like we discussed in the initial interviews, it was your experience that you had transcended these fetters, and that you're unable to experience some of these negative emotions, sort of quote unquote, craving, attachment, etc., aversion. But now you've changed your mind. You said things have changed. Your experience has changed. I'm curious about that moment of change. Was there a moment when you experienced something that you thought you'd left behind a long time ago? Something sort of in the realm of the fetters, according to that old model. And what was that like? Did it take you some time to recognize that? Was it instant recognition? When did your mind change about that whole model?
Yeah, I don't think there was one moment as such that made me realize this. It was a few things. For me personally, it was the realization that I had continued to keep seeking and searching, one. And second, the realization that actually I did desire, and I still do desire, to have a family, to have a relationship, and to be in the lay life in all its facets. That's the main thing that really made me question this whole process. And also my interactions with people in general, whether it was with my friends or whether it was with people who I was talking with, I could notice how there were still some projections of what I thought about them or how I saw them that came from my shadows, right? Maybe I was looking for an authority figure or a father figure in someone, or maybe this person was sort of representing my relationship with my mother, or whatever it is that came about. And that made me question my whole process, right? So it wasn't just one thing. It was over a series of events that then culminated into real, true reflection over this last year. The other thing I would say is those shadows that do come up, they helped me to actually go back and see where am I in my practice? Am I able to actually use the practice to deal with those shadows? Like, for example, the TWIM model of the 6 R's. And I came to the realization that sometimes you need something more than just one methodology. And there's a tendency to use one methodology as a way of glossing over these things. And so at the surface level, let's say at the time when we had our first discussion 3 years ago, it would have felt that way because everything seemed wonderful. Everything seemed great. And you go back into the world and then you not only deal with conflict, but you see your reactions to those conflicts. Like you project ideas of perfection on other people. I'm talking for myself. I projected ideas of perfection on other people, like monastics, and I became disillusioned with that. I projected this idea that perfection meant that you no longer experienced the desire for certain things like wealth or money, like money, power, and sex. I think these 3 things are so misrepresented and made into like a fetish by so many of the different spiritual organizations and communities that the repression of it has created more problems than the desire to solve. So for me as a teacher, part of your question was also about the fact that, you do have people in spiritual circles who are leaders in their community and they need to maintain the image. And therefore they might notice these shadows coming up, but they might just put them aside and try to still maintain that image. I can't do that, and I don't want to do that. If I'm considered to be a leader of the TWIM community, then I want to be upright and forthright with this. So what I want to say about that is, first and foremost, I don't see myself as a teacher anymore. That doesn't mean that I'm going to stop teaching. I see myself as like a mirror. I see myself as being a reflector, reflecting the things that people are giving to me. So one of the ways that I teach is people come to me for interviews, in their practice during the retreats. And what I've noticed is I was just following the protocol, which is, okay, you ask these 5 basic questions, and that's in order to fit into the narrative of success of what this practice can do for someone. But then I was not really being true to being a teacher, which is really being that mirror. Like a teacher is not someone who says, do as I say. It's more of like, let's walk on this path together. That's the way I would see it. And that's the way I would like it moving forward. And that's the way I've been trying to make it for a lot of people. So we need to humanize our teachers. We need to bring them off the pedestal. But teachers themselves also have to realize that. And I think it takes time, it takes some effort, and it takes a real good look in the mirror to assess that. Because the pride of being a teacher or the identification of being a spiritual leader, if anything else is corruptive in this world, I think that's it. Because that not only corrupts your own soul, though that doesn't just corrupt your own mind and heart, but that corruption leaks out into the students as well in all kinds of errant behaviors.
When you say that, errant behaviors, what's in your mind when you refer to that?
Well, I mean, sexual abuse for one is a big one. money laundering, you name it, any kind of thing that's going on. Spiritual leaders will talk about, don't be celibate, don't get married, don't do this. And then a few years later, you find out that they've raped someone. This happens in India. Almost every spiritual leader I've heard of has gone through that and has just basically besmirched the whole idea of spirituality or their particular tradition, because it's the hypocrisy, really, right? And that, I'm not trying to condemn them in the sense of like they're bad people. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. I'm not to judge that, but I'm saying spiritual community leaders should take a very hard look at themselves and notice if what they're saying matches with their internal state. And if it doesn't, then don't say anything, right? Just for the sake of it. Because if you have troubles with sex, then why would you tell someone be celibate? If you have issues, if you have desire for money, why tell someone, give me all your money? That's really what it is. I've noticed that with some spiritual leaders in the community that I've led, in the community that I've worked with. I've never heard of any allegations of any kind of sexual abuse, but in my experience with certain monastics, they might be very happy-go-lucky. They profess loving kindness and they're very smiley, and they say, I don't touch money. But I've seen them behind closed doors, and I've seen how they react when it comes to money. I've seen them how they react when they, backbite about other people and so on. So be human. I'm just saying, for any teacher who is a teacher, just be human, be authentic, be who you are, instead of serving what is really selfish desires to be seen as a certain way. And I think I would love, because this platform I want to use to tell everybody who is watching this, do not see perfection in me. I'm saying this now. Everything else I have said in the past was a reflection of my experience at the time. But now, having gone through this process and grown through it, I would love to tell everybody that do not seek perfection in me as a teacher, and do not seek perfection in any teacher at all. See them as human beings. See them with their own challenges. And anybody else who tells you otherwise is either, one, at the very outset, manipulating, or they just are not aware or afraid to face those shadow aspects of themselves.
So what Delson said here about the importance of authenticity, that is true. People should be authentic. This is a big problem with the TWIM community, with the Sutavadins, and with Delson himself in particular, is that they would present themselves as being much more attained in terms of ethics and morality than they actually were. And all the fake smiling is a big part of it. They would smile at you at the same time they're wishing you harm. And this is an important thing to understand, is that a killer can smile as he kills. The smiling is not necessarily a sign of goodwill. And you see this with the Sutavadins. They would happily smile at you while telling you something or encouraging you to do something that they knew would cause harm. They will happily smile while they avoid taking responsibility for the harm they caused. And that is insincerity. That's inauthenticity. And that is quite destructive to the possibility of true development. That being said, people should still be good. They should be authentic and good, be authentically good. And it seems like what Delson is trying to do here is lower the bar and say everyone should be authentically bad. If you're going to, seek after money and abuse your students, just be open about it. No, they shouldn't be doing those things anyway. It's in the true Dhamma. It's about eliminating the causes of these actions, not just pretending. And some people are better at pretending than others, but nobody who's pretending is ever sufficiently good at it to avoid these scenarios that Delson has related. If their thoughts are constantly inclining toward these evil actions, then it's only a matter of time before those actions find their expression. Okay, this last point he makes about don't believe anyone who says that they're beyond these things. Well, this is something that Delson can only say because he doesn't have faith in the Buddha's awakening. This statement that he made would apply to the Buddha as well. He's saying that the Buddha really hadn't overcome the things that he claimed to overcome. And that's not the case. The Buddha truly did put everything unwholesome behind him. And I know it's hard to believe. I understand that it's hard to believe. It was hard for me to believe at one point too. But then I saw it for myself. I saw the truth of it. And it is possible. You have to understand. It's very defeating to tell people that it's not possible. And this is something that has been a struggle for me with this channel. I've made several videos pointing out people's false claims of awakening. And that's not something that I take pleasure in doing, because it does damage people's faith in a sense. If they believed in this person, they believed in the possibility of awakening, and you're saying that all these people aren't really awakened, well then it must not be possible. But I'm not saying it's not possible. It is possible. The two things can be true at the same time. It's possible to attain what the Arahants of the past attained, and no one alive today has attained that state. Those two things are true at the same time. And it's very unfortunate that we don't have these living examples of Arahants. I personally sacrificed more than you can imagine to try and bring that about, make that a reality. I had great hope that Delson might have really been that at one point in time, before he proved to me that the case was otherwise. But what he's saying here is very, very bad. He's trying to convince people that it's not possible to get rid of this shadow self, or however you want to describe it, to get rid of the corruptions, the asavas. It is possible. People have done it in the past. But if you don't believe it's possible, you're not going to try. And you'll never find out.
Is this what you mean in another article, which I believe you're going to publish soon, that you sent to me, Kill the Buddha?
Yes. The subtitle of that article is, Ending Guru Worship for True Spiritual Liberation. And in that article, what I really touch upon is a couple of things. One is, okay, so if there was a goal for me as a teacher, again, as I'm saying, as a teacher, quote unquote, as a leader of a practice or somebody who's guiding people, is self-empowerment. And the idea of guru worship is to be humble, is to humble yourself in front of the guru. But I kind of see that as a power play more than anything else. And it's a reflection of the culture, whether it is in ancient Indian times, or whether it's now, or whether it's in any country, any culture. There's always that power play. And there's always you must respect your teachers. You must respect.
Just a comment here. Delson had a list of rules for his interactions with his followers on his retreats. You weren't permitted to cross your arms while he was speaking, and all manner of things that he had enforced. So it's pretty rich to hear him say this now.
Your elders and all of that. There is some credence to that insofar as basic decency and respect, of course. But the idea of revering the teacher as God, or greater than God even sometimes, diminishes the value of the student's experience. And not only that, it disempowers the student. So my intention behind that article that will come out soon is to show a couple of things. One is, when it comes to a responsibility of a teacher, they should hold space for a student to be able to empower themselves. And I think now more than ever, when we are getting into the territory of artificial intelligence, and I mean, I'm telling you, the next couple of years, things that are going to happen are going to reflect the consciousness of the entire world in a way that we might not be happy with. And there has to be a way to deal with that. And I think I'm urging, this is a message for all spiritual teachers, is to hold that space for the next generations to come, to empower themselves and to come out of that fake idea of human connection, which is only through technology and social media and artificial intelligence and so on, because I see that happening more and more. And I think people should become aware of that. When it comes to modern dating, for example, or having just any relationship with a person, it has been so undervalued and diminished because it's seen as like, if you don't serve what I want, then there's something wrong either with me or there's something wrong or with you. And I want people to question themselves and question their own intentions and question their own ideas, just as I have as a teacher and just as I have as a human, as a person. And so I think a teacher's responsibility is to show that, hey, I'm here with you. I'm going to take you on the path. I will help you as far as I can, but you need to walk your path as well. And that path might not be the same as my path, but I'll be there to help you empower yourself. So if anything, I am the anti-guru. I don't want to be the guru. I want to be the anti-guru, right? And so that's the intention behind this article. Kill the Buddha and leave no trace, is to let go of the cultural projections of what it means to be a teacher and a good student and empower yourself.
One of the pieces of feedback that I received quite a bit from our previous interviews was, a general admiration for your willingness to share your personal experience so directly and openly. And I think, on top of that, you're willing to share your experience when it changes. And I think that's even more admirable. But also it was that there was a sense of inspiration, a sense of, oh, fantastic, somebody is talking here about getting somewhere with this and having broken through to all kinds of experiences. And practitioners, long-term practitioners, some said to me, I feel reinvigorated and re-inspired by this episode, by what Delson said. And so I'd like to return to that for a moment. And it doesn't sound to me like you're saying awakening is not possible, but to set up a question, I'll say that. Are you saying then that awakening is not possible, or that it's not possible through Buddhism or TWIM? Are you opening up more possibility? Are you denying or shutting down that previous possibility? How do you relate to this whole idea of people's, if you want, where people can go with this stuff?
Yeah. I'm saying that the notions of awakening that I had through my previous experiences, whether it's in TWIM, whether it's in Vedanta, whether it's in Kriya Yoga, has always been motivated by the desire to be released from any kind of emotional and mental suffering. And I have found great benefit from that, but I don't believe that is permanent. What I'm saying is those notions of awakening, which I also actually point out in the article, which is that awakening is not a static thing. I see awakening as a process that happens all throughout your life. And they might be defined by various stages, not necessarily reflecting the experience of someone like the Buddha or Jesus or any other, wonderful spiritual teacher and figure, or not even necessarily reflecting the experience of your peers. And I say that because everybody has their own karma. Everybody has their own mental makeup. Everybody has their own trauma to deal with. Everybody has their own experiences that they have to go through or have gone through that shape that process of awakening. What I would say awakening is being awakened to the true nature of what everything is. But at the same time, there's still work to be done in terms of how do you live in this life? To that extent, you could say awakening, or I would say awakening is awakening to your shadow self, awakening to the aspects of yourself that you're running away from, awakening to the fact that you're still suffering, when in fact you did experience the end of suffering temporarily, let's say, but awakening to or awakening from the cultural dream and idealization of awakening, right? So I would say awakening is very personal to everybody, but it's awakening to all of these things. And there are levels of awakening to that extent. You awaken to the fact that you are as a mind and as a body. And then you awaken from that fact where you have more self and greater self-awareness. And then you awaken from that and you see, okay, all of these are causes and conditions. And then you awaken from that and you realize, okay, this is maybe my path. And then you see how this path works for you or not. So I'm not saying that I denounce awakening altogether, but I am definitely redefining what awakening actually means. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I mean, if you think about the word awakening, it's a verb, it's a continuous process. And you're awakened at one point, and maybe you're not awakened at another point. And the way I see, in my experience, the true nature of existence and the true nature of reality is that it is empty of any kind of personal projections of self. The world that we make around us exists in here. Our mind is samsara. But once we're able to let go of the mind's grasping and the mind's desire to make sense of things and stop projecting a meaning onto it for the sense of mental and emotional comfort, then we come to a different level of awakening, which is the realization that everything is interconnected, and that indeed the entire universe is brimming with aliveness. And this I've seen in my own experience, and I've seen from other students' experiences, where they experience a level of intuition and synchronicity where it's like freaky. It's like they see something and they thought about something and they make the connections. And what I tell to them and what I do for myself is you go deeper into the rabbit hole of these synchronicities, because these are messages from your intuition, which is nothing more than a mirror reflection of the aliveness of the entire universe. And in that aliveness of the entire universe is the entire drama of life that is consensual amongst all of us as beings, but also the internal drama that we project out due to causes and conditions.
In your declaration, you all.
So this is a very confused response, and Delson just seems to be settling on sort of a generic spirituality definition of awakening. Obviously, Delson's been influenced by many different views, and his former teacher, Bhante Vimalaramsi, was influenced by New Age views primarily. And this insight into the interconnectedness of all things. It's hardly unique to Delson, and it's quite common among the drug users, etc. So perhaps Delson is thinking that he can broaden his audience and acquire more followers by making his views to be more generic and in line with what is commonly held.
Also, mention here, I'll quote you again, I have spoken of many uncanny and strange experiences in my life and in the lives of others, like Bhante Vimalaramsi. These experiences, however interesting, are not central to what I consider the spiritual path, and can often be nothing more than a distraction. For that reason, going forward, I wish to focus on what is essential to awakening and leave these colourful anecdotes for sharing in a different context. So another characteristic, I think, of our prior interviews, particularly the second one, Siddha Tales, is you shared all kinds of, as you put them here, your uncanny and strange experiences. Remarkable accounts they were, in fact. I wonder if you might comment a bit on those and about what you're saying here in this paragraph that I've just quoted you.
First of all, that interview we had, Siddha Tales one, that was from my prior experiences through not only TWIM, but even prior to TWIM. We talked about the cobbler, we talked about, my past lives and all kinds of interesting things. And I stand by them, and I know that they're helpful for some people. But I've also seen that when people come and approach me as a teacher, or they come to my retreats, they come with this desire to know more about those things, which is, wherever a person is, they're interested in that particular thing, and that's okay. But it's sort of, for me as a teacher, it's like, hey, okay, let's leave that aside and let's talk about your practice, what's going on, and what are you up to, and where are you at, and all of these things. And that gets in the way of that, talking about siddhis, and talking about Bhante. I mean, I did a recent, not recent, but it was a few days after Bhante passed on. I did a talk talking about Bhante's life and talking about where he is, or where what he's experienced, and the stuff that I understand it to be from my own intuition and from my own experience. And I got a lot of flack for that. Rightly so, because people are probably expecting something else, and they were like, what is this guy talking about, and why is he talking about this? And so I'm not saying that I wouldn't be talking about these things, but I realize where their value is, which is at the level of curiosity and at the level of perhaps inspiring people to be like, hey, how do I get there? Or is this possible for me? Sure, it is. Maybe it can happen, maybe it can't happen, but do you want to stay in the territory of these kinds of things as a practitioner, or do you want to also explore? See, I'm saying also, because I'm not saying you need to forego those. They have their space, they have their place. That's what I'm saying in a different context of sharing. But if the approach for a person is to go into awakening, there are other things to explore there. So that's why I'm saying, like, I want to be more careful about these things, not because it's unhelpful for people. Ultimately, I think it's unhelpful for people. It might inspire them in the beginning, but because I think it's something that just gets in the way of my teaching process and gets in the way of people truly wanting to see what awakening is or what is possible for them. So it's been a bit of a challenge to weed out, let's say, the serious practitioners, for lack of a better word or term, than the ones who are just curious. And I see this a lot in India, for sure. Like when I was in India, I am in India now, but like in teaching in India, almost every other question was like, oh, so what are the devas like? What is this realm like? And, all of these things. And I would have to redirect them and say, you might be able to experience it for yourself. Why don't we talk about like how that can be possible for you, and try to redirect them towards the practice? And so for me, it's just been, it's been a, let's say, misutilization of my time, energy, and attention where I might want it to go to.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I'm wondering, in this period of reflection, have you sought out other teachers or other teachings, had fellowship with people in that kind of a context, in other traditions perhaps, or within, Buddhism or anything else? I'm wondering if you've done any of that.
Oh yeah, for sure. Actually, earlier this year, I had a really wonderful trip to South India with some very close friends of mine, and we had gone there for doing some temple tours based on some astrology that was done for me and for my friends. And this is a very interesting kind of astrology, actually. I mean, I just said I'm not going to talk about the more esoteric stuff, but this is really interesting. This is actually really cool. There is this thing called Nadi astrology, Nadi, Nadi astrology. And in there, what you do is they only take your thumb print, your thumb impression, and based on that, they will actually come up with who you are as a person and give you certain details that only you would know about. And so it's very interesting, that whole process of like understanding who you are, what you're here to do, and all of this. And like in India, when you do an astrological reading, there's always these kinds of like remedies that they give you, like go to this temple or offer this to the monks or whatever it is. So I said, let's go to the temples. Let's check it out. I mean, I've always wanted to go explore South India, and I think it'd be really interesting to do that. And we went to something like, I think 11 temples in the span of 10 days or 2 weeks. It was quite a journey, and it was a very satisfying journey. But as we went to these different temples, one of these temples was called Chidambaram. It's in South India. It's so there are these 5 Shiva temples which are related to the 5 elements, and the Chidambaram temple is said to have been constructed by Patanjali. And another particular deity, half man, half beast kind of thing. And it commemorates the time when Shiva and Shakti were coming together and dancing, the dance of creation and destruction. And so the main deity there is the Nataraja, which is the dancing Shiva. And there's also something called the Akasha Linga, which is like a linga, Shiva Linga, which is made out of pure crystal. Before we even entered into the annex of the temple, I could feel this like vibrant energy coming off of it. It was very blissed out. It was just amazing. And I remember like sitting in the bus on our way back to the hotel and just like amazed by this whole process. And then when I went to sleep later that night, I had an amazing, let's say amazing, but really crazy dreams. Like I remember seeing...
Just stop it here. Delson is now admitting to sleeping and having dreams. So previously he has made statements about maintaining awareness to all phases of sleep and not sleeping for extended periods of time. And I think it's interesting, either something has changed about his practices or the way he describes his experience has changed.
I remember seeing myself being in an airplane and witnessing a huge atomic explosion that went off. And then I felt that reverberating throughout my entire, from my navel upwards. And then I remember entering into the cave. And the next morning at breakfast, this intuition arose in me, is explore the divine feminine, explore the goddess energy, the Shakti. And so that stayed with me. And so because of that, and then the discussion with my friends about this, there was the idea that was probably about going back into the womb, the cave, going back into the divine feminine. And so I sought out traditions like Sri Vidya. Sri Vidya is a very interesting tradition. It's very tantric based, which means it uses different kinds of prayers and chants and techniques. And I sought out a guru, and I got some initiations into a couple of different practices, which, I can't really talk about, but basically what it is like a practice for Ganesha and a practice for what's known as Bala Tripura Sundari, who is like the child version of the divine goddess in all her glory. So this has really been something that I've been interested in since January, since that trip. And so I've been exploring things like that. But ultimately, I would say that I continue to seek, and not for any other reason.
So I would just point out that this description of these practices that Delson has been pursuing, it sounds like attachment to rites and rituals, which is one of the fetters that is lost at stream entry. Of course, Delson has already explained that he doesn't adhere to any model of fetters anymore. But I would just point out that in the teaching of the Noble Ones, this is attachment to rites and rituals.
But to learn and to understand and to contextualize for myself my own experiences, but also as in some sense a teacher, to also understand where other students are coming from. Because the more I understand, the more ocean of knowledge that I have, not only for my own curiosity, but for my own understanding of where a student is coming from, the better I can assist them according to the context that they understand.
That's quite a cool story, Delson. Very cool. It's almost like the old days, hearing you tell that.
Yeah, exactly.
What's next for you then? At the end, I'll ask you if there's anything else that you want to comment on that we haven't covered. But I think naturally, I'm thinking now ahead. What's next for you? What are your plans going forward, and where do you see things going?
Yeah, this is it's going to be interesting because I know for 2025, I'll definitely be teaching TWIM, but I'll be teaching it, let's say, in a different context, because I don't want to make it into a certain kind of protocol that we've always followed before in order for this narrative of success, as I call it. But I'll teach TWIM as I understand it, and I don't necessarily want to have to teach from the suttas all the time. But I have been developing my own way of teaching and methodologies, which I will be experimenting with and through students who are willing to come and see me. Like, I've been empowered before to initiate people in certain schools of Kriya Yoga. I might do that. I might do Kriya Yoga initiations for people. I'm developing something which I call as the optimal mind system. It's just a catchy name.
The optimal mind system, this sounds very similar to his mentor Greg Halpern's system called the Formula 4 protocol. I think this is clearly Greg's influence showing here. But this idea of initiating people who come seeking the true Dhamma into these other things, whether it's TWIM or Kriya, it's highly, highly inappropriate. And maybe Delson thinks he's getting out from under some of this bad karma by being open about what he's doing. But again, being authentic, it doesn't count for much if you're being authentically evil. Authenticity is valuable when it's attached to what's good. And what Delson is offering here isn't what's good. People are coming to him seeking instruction in that which is beneficial, and he's offering them instruction in that which is not beneficial.
Because it's got O and M, it's Om, the Om system. That's the only reason. But it's sort of a distillation of all of the things that I've learned related to the mind, body, and energetics of the body and the mind. So I might go into that. And whatever I have learned, for me, I see myself as sort of like this conduit for various teachings. And I think there's so much more that I can give and offer to the world based on people's curiosities, but of course, their seriousness in wanting to engage with these practices. So what I'm saying is, I want to teach what I know. And it's not just TWIM. It is anything that I've learned in the past that I'm empowered to show people. So in the future, it'll be interesting because I know in 2025, everything is sort of already planned out. And I will tell you, from that declaration video within the TWIM community, I've had a wonderful amounts of support. And I think there's a certain kind of sigh of relief in the psyche of the community where, like, we don't need to be so perfect. We don't need to do these things. And also, like, there is other things that we can explore. And I'm available to those people in the community and at large to show them what they want. You know, I also see that 2026 is a very vital year for everybody in terms of like the consciousness of people from 2026 to 2027. I believe there will be a thinning of the veil when it comes to what we see as this reality. And I think there will be a larger interest and a serious investigation into the more esoteric aspects of life and into trying to understand what the hell is going on when whatever is going to happen in 2026 happens. I think there's going to be interesting phenomena that's going to happen. It's just my intuition and my understanding of how I see things. And for that reason, I think I'm kind of primed to help those individuals to better understand their place in the universe and how this whole process works.
Well, Delson, this has been a tremendous discussion. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast to discuss your latest reflections on all that's gone on. Is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion? Anything you'd like to add, or any way you'd like to sum up our conversation before we bring it to an end?
Yeah, I mean, just to sum up our conversation, and my personal message to everybody is this. Your journey is your own, and make it your own. Use the tools and the teachers that you have as vehicles for your own empowerment. And in the most silent moments of your life, when you can just relax into that moment, then you realize that you are already liberated.
Delson Armstrong, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles.
So that's the end of the interview. There were a few encouraging things about this and much that was discouraging. It didn't seem that much changed in Delson's views, aside from the fact that he was willing to be more forthcoming about what his views were. And in any case, he's never let go of his attachment to these practices from his past, these beliefs from his past. So it's not the case of him having given these things up, changed in some way and returned to them. He really just acted for some period of time, which I think he would probably admit, but maybe phrase it differently. So while I did hope that Delson would find it within himself to admit what he had done and come clean about his false claims of attainment, the reality of it, the way he's executed it, doubling down on teaching these dangerous and misleading practices, it's not the best outcome. And with the views that seem to be established in Delson now, it seems less likely than ever that he will actually attain that which he sought after to start with. In reviewing the comments posted below this interview, I see many people, obviously fans of Delson, praising him for being honest and brave in what he's done. But I see nothing honest about misrepresenting the teaching of the Buddha and misrepresenting his own attainments in that teaching for years. I see nothing brave about his ignoring my communications and my offer, very generous offer, to host him in my home to discuss the Dhamma in detail. The Blessed One said that men, such as Delson, should be regarded as the vilest of outcasts, that is, men who represent themselves as being arahants, though they are not. Even now, Delson is still using weasel word language to continue to represent himself as an arahant, although under a different definition of arahant, similar to what people such as Daniel Ingram have been doing for a long time. This does not represent an evolution for Delson's character. It's only like a venomous snake shedding its old skin only to reveal a new skin identical to that which came before. Unfortunately, Delson has not pointed himself in a good direction. Despite all this time and so many opportunities, so many resources given to him, so much support, Delson hasn't really grown at all. It's not a case of him having advanced and then regressed to where he started out, as it may appear to some. He never advanced at all. He's just thrown himself into one delusion after another. First with his early yoga experiences, then with his experience with Greg Halpern, then with his experience with TWIM and Bhante Vimalaramsi, and now he's opened himself up to new horizons of delusion. And he intends to drag others along with him into Mara's net. And while there's still some time for Delson to make the changes that are necessary, I see very little indication that he has the integrity to do so. But my invitation to you, Delson, if you watch this, is prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. Start doing the right thing. Try that out. See how that goes. You still have time, and you've got apparently unlimited resources. I'll leave it there.